Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We're opening up the sources today for a deep dive into what looks like a very simple moment in the covenant story, but one that is just packed with meaning.
It really is.
Yeah.
Today we're focused on Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 8.
And our sources for this are some really concentrated scholarly exegesis, all looking at divine visitation and what you could call covenant ethics.
That's right. We're really zeroing in on Abraham's response at the oaks of Mamre. I mean, it's just a few verses about a generous meal, but it really reveals the whole shape of faith.
I think so too. Our goal here is to try and extract the theological and the ethical insights from this story of hospitality. It's not just a lesson in ancient manner.
No, not at all, though it certainly have applications there. It's more like a window into the nature of covenant communion itself. How does God approach humanity, and how does a life of faith actually recognize and respond to that?
Yeah, that's the key question.
And the core idea, the thing our sources just kept bringing to the front, is this. The whole story places God's gracious self-disclosure, his condescension, at the absolute beginning of the encounter.
It starts with God.
It has to. And this divine presence, it just demands this radical priority from Abraham. It forces us to sort of abandon the assumption that communion is something we achieve through our own effort.
Right, instead of something that's just granted by divine grace.
Exactly. We always begin with God.
Okay, let's unpack that opening statement then. The theological foundation, it's all right there in verse 1. We have to start with what the scholars call the narrative headwaters, because that first verb really does set the stage for everything else.
Absolutely. The opening is deceptively calm. It just says, the Lord appeared, or vayera in the Hebrew.
And that's the key.
That is the key that interprets the entire scene. I mean, it's like the theological thunderclap hidden in this very simple narrative clause.
Yeah.
The Lord, Yahweh himself, is the subject of the action. He's the one moving.
Which means Abraham is fundamentally not the prime mover in this. The text actually makes a point of describing his posture. He's simply sitting at the door of his tent in the heat of the day.
Right. He isn't initiating anything. He's not trying to climb some mystical ladder to God. He's not performing a ritual to try and manipulate God's presence.
He's just resting.
He is. And Moses is insisting here that this covenant fellowship is a gift. It's freely given. It's not a wage that's earned by human striving. It's a sovereign act. Long before Abraham ever opens his home, God opens himself. He accommodates himself so that a creature can actually receive him.
So the Lord's appearing is this proclamation that the God of heaven is pleased to draw near to his chosen people, even when, they're just resting or passive.
Right. And the sheer ordinariness of the setting reinforces that. It's Mamre, it's his tent, it's the heat of the day.
Let's talk about that, because in the ancient Near East, the heat of the day, say from noon to 3 or 4 in the afternoon, that was a time of forced inactivity.
That's such a critical piece of context that we often just read right over.
Yeah.
In that climate, this was the moment for retreat, for shade. You minimize movement to preserve energy, to avoid sunstroke. It was the time travelers would look for shelter.
So for the Lord to choose this time, the most inconvenient, the least expected time, it just highlights his gracious choice to interrupt the normal rhythm of life.
It's a deliberate visitation. It comes at the very moment when an interruption is probably least welcome.
It really does strip away that modern idea that we can somehow engineer communion with God, by timing our devotions just right or manufacturing some big emotional crescendo. The Lord visits his people in the middle of ordinary, inconvenient life, not just at some dramatic altar or on a mountaintop.
If God draws near, it's because God wills to draw near. Full stop. It doesn't make the encounter common. It just makes God's grace completely astonishing. The focus is entirely on the divine initiative. Abraham is settled, he's vulnerable, he's taking his ease, and that is precisely when the visitation happens.
Which brings us to the nature of the appearing itself, this idea of accommodation and Christophany. The Lord draws near in a way that's fitted to human limitation. He appears as 3 men.
Right. But the sources are quick to identify that central figure, the one from verse 1, as the Lord himself, the pre-incarnate Lord Jesus Christ.
And the text itself seems to compel that. Verse 1 says the Lord appeared to Abraham, but then verse 2 immediately says Abraham saw 3 men.
Exactly. This is God revealing himself truly, but without surrendering his divine transcendence. It's the infinite Lord stooping down, making himself comprehensible to finite human senses. That is the very definition of divine accommodation.
We should probably pause here because this concept of Christophany is theologically massive. It's what gives us that canonical coherence. We look to the New Testament, right? John 1:18, where the apostle confirms the Father is invisible. No one has ever seen God.
And if the Father is invisible, then every visible, localized manifestation of Yahweh in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord, the figure at the burning bush, or right here at Mamre, it has to be understood as the second person of the Trinity.
Acting in his office as mediator.
Yes. He is the only person of the Godhead who has historically interacted with creation in a bodily, apprehensible form.
And this isn't just some interesting footnote, is it? It's what connects Abraham directly to the fulfillment of the covenant. When Jesus tells the Pharisees in John 8:56, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day," he's giving a divine commentary on this very moment.
He is. Abraham was seeing the Lord Jesus Christ centuries before the incarnation. The Son of God, the eternal Word, condescended to walk the dust of the earth, anticipating the day he would take on flesh permanently.
And this aligns perfectly with, say, the teaching of the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 8, Section 2.
Let's linger on that for a second, because that can confuse people who are newer to Reformed theology. Sure. The confession teaches that Christ is the mediator of the elect in all ages, not just after his birth in Bethlehem.
So how does this appearance in Genesis 18 fit into that framework?
Well, it's crucial. The covenant of grace, which includes all the elect, has one mediator, Christ. That covenant didn't just pop into existence at the cross. It was administered differently throughout history. In the Old Testament, it was administered through promises, sacrifices, typological manifestations.
Like this one.
Like this one. The appearance at Mamre is one of those manifestations. It's Christ, by divine self-disclosure, initiating the redemptive work with Abraham, strengthening him to receive the promise. He's acting as the mediator, the bridge between a transcendent God and a finite man, even then.
So the Lord's appearing isn't some sentimental story. It's a theological anchor that guarantees Abraham's faith is grounded in the true mediator. And the order of events here matters a lot, doesn't it? It points to the priority of fellowship.
The sequencing is everything. This appearance of the Lord, this moment of gracious fellowship, it precedes the renewed announcement of the promise of Isaac, which comes in verse 9 and onwards.
So God doesn't just hand Abraham a set of propositions like some detached lecturer.
No. Communion precedes confirmation. Fellowship is not a reward for believing the promise. It is the gracious means by which God strengthens the believer to receive that promise.
Especially a promise as difficult to believe as, a son for a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman.
If we reverse that order, if we make Abraham's strenuous hospitality the cause rather than the fruit of this fellowship, we quietly smuggle in a principle of works.
Which is totally foreign to what Moses is doing here.
Completely. The scene anchors everything that follows in the initiative of God. It asks us, do we know the living God as the one who comes to us by sheer kindness? Or have we just reduced him to an idea we manage or a ritual we perform?
Okay, so the stage is set by God's movement. Now the camera shifts, and it shifts dramatically from that divine initiative to Abraham's immediate reaction. The sources call this faith's posture and speech. And it starts with this radical bodily motion.
Yes, verse 2 shifts from Abraham's passive sitting to this explosion of active, purposeful verbs. He lifted up his eyes and looked, which suggests that a living faith cultivates a readiness to receive God's providences. He's not sleeping, he's resting, but he's ready to move.
And the action that follows is incredibly telling. The text says Abraham ran rats in the Hebrew from the tent door to meet them. When you think about the circumstances, that is just a striking detail.
It is, and it's crucial to remember the context we just talked about. He's 99 years old.
And he's physically vulnerable. He just underwent circumcision only 3 days before this. Genesis 17 tells us that.
Right, so if any person had a legitimate physical excuse for moving slowly, it would be Abraham.
A 99-year-old man recovering from surgery in the hottest part of the day runs to greet guests.
Moses uses that word rats very deliberately. In a culture where status and age often justified slow, deliberate movement, a kind of studied dignity, the patriarch's haste is a strong rebuke to any kind of spiritual lethargy.
He doesn't treat them like an inconvenience.
No, not at all. He receives them with honor and immediate priority. His physical action proclaims his spiritual state. He is quick to obey.
I think many of us, we talk about God's nearness, but our lives are marked by endless delays in obedience or in service or in love. And we cite inconvenience or discomfort. Abraham's running just exposes that.
And right alongside that urgency, we find this radical reverence. Immediately after running, he bowed himself to the earth, or shakha. This is prostration. It's reserved for royalty or divinity. It shows he recognized the weight of this encounter.
His body is preaching theology, isn't it? He recognizes that true dignity is only found in submission to the divine guest. His reverence is the absolute opposite of our modern temptation to domesticate God, to treat him like a casual friend.
And the beauty is in the synthesis of the two. Moses holds urgency and reverence together, the running and the bowing. And that synthesis prevents two spiritual distortions that really plague the church today.
Which are what?
Well, first, the running prevents a cold formality that can mistake reverence for distance. Abraham isn't just ceremonial, he's eager. He's active. He doesn't hold the guests at arm's length.
Okay.
And second, the bowing prevents a shallow familiarity that mistakes closeness for casualness. He's quick, but he is low. He's warm, but he's deeply humbled. He's quick to serve, but never presumptuous.
That balance leads perfectly into his speech in verses 3 through 5. He addresses the leader, who we've identified as the Christophany, as Adonai.
Yes, and this is where a little technical detail really helps. The term Adonai would mean sir or master, just a title of respect. But the Masoretic vowel pointing that's used here strongly supports Adonai, which is reserved specifically for God.
Let's just pause and explain what that means for our listeners. The original Hebrew text was just consonants. Centuries later, Jewish scribes, called the Masoretes, added these little vowel markers or points to standardize the pronunciation.
Right. And their choice of vowel markers here points us toward the divine interpretation of the address. It confirms what verse 1 already said. Abraham recognized a divine quality in this specific visitor.
But even more significant than the title is the plea itself. O Lord, if I have found favor or chen in your sight, do not pass by your servant.
He doesn't presume upon his covenant status. This isn't entitlement. He doesn't say, hey, I'm Abraham, I demand your attention.
No, it's an appeal solely to grace, to chen.
That phrase, if I have found favor, is so important. It just destroys the idol of entitlement that constantly plagues religious performance. Abraham expresses this profound dependence. It's the reflex of a man who has learned that all blessing, all service, all access comes purely from the Lord's kindness, not his own merit.
The true saint knows that serving God is not a burden to be borne, but a gift to be seized.
That's well said. And the invitation that follows is so practical, so humble. Water for washing their feet, rest under the tree, and then a morsel of bread for refreshment.
His hospitality is so concrete. It's centered on mercy, not on showmanship. He addresses the needs of these weary travelers first.
Exactly. The water for the dusty feet, the rest in the shade. These are basic necessities. True service has a tenderness to it. It starts with care before it rushes to impress.
And that modesty is striking. He calls this feast he's planning a morsel, a small portion. The scholars all agree that this is just an expression of humility. He's under-promising what he intends to deliver.
It's deliberate rhetoric. He's not advertising his own generosity. His focus is entirely on the guest's refreshment, not on his own reputation. He is free to give because he's not seeking to buy praise or status.
It's such a bracing corrective to a lot of modern hospitality that's, curated for social media, designed to be photographed and shared rather than genuinely received.
And he also anchors their arrival in providence. Since you have come to your servant. He sees this interruption not as an accident, but as a divinely governed event.
That is the ultimate ethical takeaway from his speech, I think. If God governs the steps of men, then the neighbor, the visitor, the stranger at my door is not just an accident, he's a stewardship.
Abraham is practicing hospitality not to gain God's favor, but because he lives under God's favor. Grace is the root. Immediate reverent service is the fruit.
And the scene just explodes into action again in verses 6 through 8. We move from that humble speech to this frantic concrete labor. This is faith's work, the grammar of lavish provision.
Right. Faith is never passive. It has to work itself out in tangible ways. And Moses deliberately uses this key recurring theme of urgency here. Mahar, which means to hasten or to hurry, and that word appears 3 times, bang, 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 in verses 6 and 7.
The man who bowed in reverence now bustles in service.
He does. And the urgency he showed running to the guests is immediately transferred to the preparation for the guests. He goes quickly to Sarah and says, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes.
He mobilizes his whole household, which is a reminder that covenant ethics, they apply to the corporate family posture, not just individual acts of piety.
And the haste isn't anxious panic. It's joyful, focused speed. Grace makes excuses lose their power. He doesn't say, Sarah, it's hot, we're tired, or we only have the cheap flour. He immediately mobilizes the absolute best resources God has given him.
Let's get into the extravagance here, because a morsel of bread quickly becomes this huge feast. 3 seahs of fine flour. What is that exactly?
It's a massive amount. The
No.
sea is roughly 7 liters, so we're talking about over 21 liters of flour.
Wow. And not just any flour.
No, it's solith. And for a listener focused on covenant theology, this detail is incredibly significant. Solith is the highest quality, finely sifted grain. It's later reserved specifically for the Levitical grain offerings in the temple system. We see that in Leviticus 2.
So he's not offering the common stuff. He's offering the sacrificial best, the equivalent of a holy offering.
And that amount of flour, over 20 liters, it's enough to feed dozens of people. It vastly exceeds the needs of just 3 travelers.
It says a lot about the value he places on this visitation. But he doesn't stop there. He then runs to the herd. He doesn't send a servant. He runs himself and takes a calf, tender and good.
In an agrarian, semi-nomadic economy like Abraham's, that calf is a significant capital investment. Meat was a luxury. It was reserved for major festivals, covenant ceremonies, or honoring great kings.
And taking one described as tender and good means he's taking the best of stock, the one that represents future increase, the one he would naturally want to save for himself.
This lavishness is the absolute opposite of the leftover mentality that's so often present in our devotion.
It's a powerful contrast to what we read later in the prophets, like in Malachi, where the Lord rebukes Israel for offering blind and lame animals.
Exactly. Abraham gives the best away because his grip on his possessions has been loosened by his trust in God's covenant promise. His generosity is an act of theological confidence. He knows the Lord who gives the promise is the one who guarantees his prosperity.
Faith doesn't ask, what's the minimum I have to do? It asks, how may I best honor this divine guest?
Right, and after all this frenetic activity, the running, the hastening, the sacrifice of the calf, the narrative pace slows right down. It's the consummation of communion in verse 8, the rest.
After all the mahar, the text comes to this profound stillness. Abraham set it before them, the curds, the milk, the calf, and then he stood by them, amad, under the tree while they ate.
That's the posture of an attentive servant.
He doesn't sit down, he doesn't make himself the center of attention or even join the meal. He remains upright and attentive. It emphasizes that biblical hospitality is always about the guest being cared for and honored, not the host being admired.
And that attentive service reinforces the theological point. The bustling activity of the believer finds its ultimate end in the quiet satisfaction of God. And this whole encounter, this table fellowship, it functions as a moment of covenant ratification. It strengthens Abraham for what's coming next.
Which connects directly to the doctrine of providence. The sources note the Westminster Confession, chapter 5, which teaches that God governs all creatures and all actions, including this meal, to fulfill his redemptive purposes.
The fellowship is a means to an end. It's immediately followed by the conversation about Sarah and the promise of Isaac. God didn't need the meal, but Abraham needed the fellowship to fortify his faith to receive that impossible promise. The visit under the tree is key to the birth of the covenant son.
Okay, so this event at Mamre isn't just an isolated miracle. It has to be viewed along the canonical trajectory that points toward Christ.
Absolutely. The visitation itself is this early glimpse of God's deep desire to dwell with his people.
And the pattern is consistent. God draws near in accommodated fellowship, allowing flawed humanity to interact with him. You see this all through the canon.
You do, from the garden to the tabernacle and temple, which later regulate this reality. They teach about the cost of communion and holiness, but they also keep alive the hope that this nearness won't always be confined to shadows and symbols.
And the ultimate realization of that desire to dwell is, of course, the incarnation. What Genesis 18 shows in seed form, God taking a temporary human-like form to draw near, finds its fullest historical expression when the eternal Son takes on true and permanent humanity.
And the language of John's gospel confirms this. It says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. John 1:14. That's the climactic realization of what Abraham tasted at his tent door. God with us, Emmanuel.
The divine visitor who ate a meal with Abraham is the very one who later became flesh.
Yes, and Jesus' earthly ministry repeatedly expressed this nearness through table fellowship, eating with sinners, using meals as signs of acceptance and forgiveness.
There's a beautiful shadow and substance contrast here. Abraham provided this lavish feast for his visitors.
But Christ provides himself as the bread of life. Abraham provided the best calf from his herd. Christ provided his own body and blood in the sacrifice.
And the contrast in their roles is equally striking. Abraham stood to serve his visitors, taking the lowest posture.
The true king reverses that pattern entirely. Christ said, I am among you as the one who serves. We see that in Luke 22. Abraham's feast is an act of generosity. Christ's feast, the Lord's Supper, is an act of redemption. The line runs straight from fellowship enjoyed by grace to fellowship purchased through the sacrifice of the mediator.
This canonical reading forces us into an application using that classic law and gospel framework, and it has to confront some of our contemporary distortions. So let's start with the law functioning as a mirror, exposing our spiritual state.
When we hold our lives up against Abraham's running and his costly labor, the law immediately exposes our spiritual sloth, our spiritual laziness. We are confronted with the sleeking the heat mentality of the contemporary church.
We're prone to offer God our worship only when it's convenient, aren't we? Only when it fits perfectly into our schedule.
Only when the heat of life's demands has cooled down. But Abraham runs when he's at his weakest, at the most inconvenient moment of the day. The law pierces the modern idol of comfort. We so often excuse ourselves from spiritual disciplines or acts of service because they clash with our personal schedules or our demands for ease.
And it confronts our leftover diversion. Abraham gave solace in a tender and good calf, the very best, a capital investment. How often do we approach God or service with just the remnants of our time, the exhausted ends of our energy, the cheapest parts of our resources?
We have to confess that tendency toward a consumer Christianity, a pragmatism that governs our giving. We ask, what's the minimum requirement to maintain my standing? Or what percentage can I spare without feeling a pinch?
The law reveals that our lack of sacrificial giving is a clear theological statement. We just don't value the visitor the way Abraham did.
We treat the Holy One as a beggar who should be grateful for our spare change, rather than the King who has already given us everything. This text just strips away every excuse for convenience and self-protection.
But the good news, the gospel, is that the text is not fundamentally about Abraham's successful running. It's about Yahweh's original appearing.
That's the indicative that grounds the imperative. The good news is that while we were sleeping in the heat of our rebellion, prioritizing our own comfort, giving God our leftovers, Christ descended.
The Christophany points us to the ultimate descent, the incarnation and the crucifixion.
Right. Jesus Christ left the glory of heaven not just to eat a meal under a tree, but to hang upon a tree for us, to become a curse for us, as Galatians 3:13 shows.
We're not accepted because our service is perfect, and certainly not because of our running or our fine flour.
No. We are accepted entirely because of the perfect active obedience of Christ, who hastened to Jerusalem to accomplish our redemption. He fulfilled every requirement of the law that we constantly fail to meet.
The gospel frees us from that impossible burden of trying to earn God's favor through our hospitality or our busyness. We've already found favorchin in his sight through the finished work of Christ.
And this leads us right to the third use of the law, as a guide for grateful obedience. Because we have found grace, we are now free to be quick to serve. We aren't serving for acceptance, we're serving from acceptance. The service then becomes an expression of gratitude for the initial divine visitation.
You think of Hebrews 13:2, which explicitly links back to this story. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares.
The text guides that grateful obedience. It shows us the quality and the posture of true Christian service. True obedience flows from communion. Our private spaces, our homes, our schedules, our resources, they aren't fortresses to protect our ease. They are embassies of the King.
So when we see visitors or strangers or interruptions, we should treat them as providences, as opportunities sent by God.
That's the shift. Let's use Abraham's example to specifically correct some of these big modern distortions of Christian living. We can start with a deep grip of consumerism.
Okay.
Consumerism views faith and church as a set of services provided for our personal satisfaction. We look for a church that meets our preferences, enhances our experience, and requires minimal inconvenience.
And Abraham's response is the antithesis of that.
Completely. Faith makes us servants, not clients, shopping for the perfect religious experience. Abraham ran to serve. He wasn't looking for self-actualization or a spiritual high. The church has to guard against becoming an entertainment center. When we're overly focused on receiving, we forget the God who came not to be served, but to give and to serve.
The second distortion would be the temptation of irreverence, that casual approach to the things of God. We noted Abraham ran and bowed.
Urgency and humility have to go together. We don't approach the means of grace worship, prayer, the scriptures with flippancy or shallow familiarity. The Lord is not just our helpful peer. He is the Holy One who condescended to visit.
So Genesis 18 shows that when God comes near, the correct reflex is reverent readiness. Warm, but without presumption. The closer God draws, the lower we have to bow.
If our excitement for God isn't tempered by a sense of his holiness, we risk treating the awesome God of the covenant like a friendly local acquaintance.
And the third distortion.
Performative hospitality. The worry about aesthetic perfection, what we might call Pinterest hosting, and the calculation of social return.
This is where we measure our success by the compliments we get or the image we maintain. You see it in church life, too, when acts of service become visible opportunities for status.
But Abraham's hospitality was quick, costly, and unadvertised. He called the feast a morsel. He underpromised and then over-delivered on sacrifice and quality. He didn't host for applause. He served because serving is the fitting response to grace.
Biblical hospitality is measured by genuine love and sacrificial cost, not image management or the need for validation.
That's right. If you're afraid to invite guests over because your house isn't perfect, you've prioritized aesthetics over love.
And finally, the text confronts the modern idol of comfort, the habit of excusing ourselves from costly obedience, which we touched on with the heat of the day.
It was precisely when service was most inconvenient that Abraham excelled. The Christian home shouldn't be a fortress built solely to preserve ease and control the schedule. It should be a workshop of service prepared for interruptions. The call here is to repent from slothful self-protection.
In a culture that's addicted to comfort and convenience, the church really has to recover the virtue of cheerful inconvenience for the sake of others.
And for the glory of the visitor, Abraham models a life where the possibility of divine presence simply outweighs the desire for personal ease. And that is a truly countercultural posture.
We have covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into Genesis 18, moving from the appearance of Yahweh to that subsequent rush of hospitality.
I think the ultimate takeaway is the theological sequencing. God's grace, the indicative, it precedes and produces Abraham's obedience, the imperative. Communion with God is granted by grace, not achieved by human striving.
And Abraham's response, the running, the bowing, the inviting, the providing, that's just the visible fruit of a man who lives entirely under divine promise.
And the grace that produced his eagerness is the same grace that forms a people marked by reverent worship and open-handed love today.
And this is where the narrative shifts one last time and shows us the scope of redemption. Let's reflect on the nature of these covenant meals. We saw that at Mamre, Abraham stood to serve the Lord. He was waiting on his guests under the tree, the attentive servant.
Because at the Lord's Supper, the roles are entirely reversed. Christ, the King who was visited under the tree at Mamre, now invites us to sit. He hosts us.
He feeds us at his table, not with the flesh of a tender calf, but with his own body and blood, spiritually present to the eye of faith.
This is the ultimate example of divine hospitality. The Lord who received service now serves us, guaranteeing our fellowship forever through his substitutionary work.
The Lord who received hospitality now hosts us eternally. That image drives us right back to the initial challenge of the text. Abraham's tent door becomes this standing invitation and a model for every believer.
So we'll close with this thought for you. Consider the posture of your own life and faith today. When the Lord's providence places an opportunity, a neighbor, or a sudden inconvenience before you, are you running to serve, or are you sleeping in the heat of the day, prioritizing your own comfort over the claims of grace?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the ethics and theology of Genesis 18. We look forward to our next study with you.